Welcome to another look at A Midsummer Night's Dream. I'm Lucy Yates for the Santa Fe Opera, and in this segment I talk with distinguished scientists, Greg Cajete, an ethnobotanist, and Stephen Goldfarb, a particle physicist, about Shakespeare's astronomical affinities and quantum intuitions, about the ways we explain what we can see, and about some of the ways we measure what we can't. We divided our talk into 3 acts: Sun and Moon, in which we visit the summer solstice and discuss ancient cosmologies; Stars and Stardust, in which we bump into some friends in the woods or in a giant collider; and Earth and Wall, in which we examine plays within plays and our place as players on this planet. Thanks for joining us in the conversation. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another look at A Midsummer Night's Dream. My name is Lucy Yates, and I am here. It took an expert on Earth and an expert on space to get us here this afternoon, and we're so grateful to the Santa Fe Opera and to Agnes Chavez for bringing together Dr. Gregory Cajete, Professor Emeritus of the University of New Mexico and former Director of Native American Studies, and Dr. Stephen Goldfarb, who is in Geneva as a particle physicist in the CERN laboratory. The two met during Agnes's Projecting Particles Collective, which was founded in 2013 as a way to bring a deeper understanding of the universe to students. And we are so thrilled to have them today to talk with me about Shakespeare. So we have a talk for you, which we think could go, stay tuned to see if it does, but we think could go in 3 acts: Sun and Moon, Stars and Stardust, and Earth and Wall. Let us begin. Gentlemen, we know that Shakespeare was at least current with his time, if not ahead of it, in matters scientific. We know that he synthesized and humanized mythology, astrology, and recent research, and often had to code the results in very elaborate imagery in his plays. So I wonder whether Greg could start us off with a story that might help us to synthesize or to understand and to place the timing of our play, which is supposed to take place around St. John's Eve and the summer solstice. So we have a lot of sun and moon imagery. Greg, what can you tell us about sun and moon in some Native traditions?
Well, sun and moon in Native traditions actually figures very large in many of our stories, many of our mythological traditions, our ceremonial traditions, because the Midsummer's Night is really the summer solstice, and during the solstice, actually all of the tribes that I am aware of have some kind of commemoration during this very special time of the cycle of the year, when the sun is at its highest point during its journey during that cycle of the year. Also, in relationship to that is the moon, and the moon, of course, has her cycles in the context of relationship to the moon and also to the earth. So this time actually figures very prominently in the stories that Native people tell. I'm aware of several stories. One that comes to mind almost immediately is a Plains story that deals with Feather Woman and Star Boy, and then evolves into a story of Scarface, a transformation that takes place, and it's all happening around the time of summer solstice. Mm-hmm. So very similar to Shakespeare's play Midsummer Night's Eve. This story begins with a Feather Woman, making a wish on the morning star. She believes the morning star is very beautiful, and wishes that she could find a husband as beautiful and as handsome as the morning star. Uh, in native thought, everything is related, and sun and moon are spirits that sometimes interact with humans and come to Earth to visit the Earth in various kinds of guises. So as she goes out to collect wood for fire, for the campfire, she encounters a very handsome young man dressed in white buckskin, and she's very startled, but very also in awe. And so she sees the young man, and he tells her, I heard your wish, and I have come to take you to my land, the land of the star people." And of course, she doesn't know what to say, but he convinces her to come with him. And he has these juniper boughs that he places her feet on, or asks her to place her feet on. She places her feet on that, and she's transported to the land of the sky people, or the star people, rather. And there, he introduces her takes her to his lodge, and introduces her to his father, who is the sun, and his mother, who is the moon. And tells them that he has chosen Feather Woman as his wife. So she becomes, as every good young bride tries to do, a part of the family, tries to follow all of the rules and regulations. One of the things that they tell her is, don't pick this giant turnip that is growing in the garden. That is a very sacred plant for us, as star people. And so she tries to abide by that. But of course, curiosity gets the best of her. And she tries to pull out this giant turnip. She can't pull it, but then two cranes come around and they help her pull the big turnip. And as they pull the big turnip, the hole that it forms provides a window back to the earth, back to her village, and she can see the buffalo, or hunters hunting the buffalo, people in camp, and life on Earth, essentially. And so she's viewing her life, Earth, on the Earth from the sky. She puts the turnip back, covers up the hole, but then goes back and confesses that she has, broken a rule of the sky people. And the sun becomes very agitated, very angry. And he banishes her back to the earth. And so she vanishes to the earth. She stays there, but she's not happy. She then moves to this large outcropping, and every morning, about morning time, she wishes on the morning star to come back and take her. And she goes with her son. They've had a son now by that time, who is called Starboy. But the morning star tells her, you can't go back. You can't go back. You can't come back, rather. And as a result of that, she stays on Earth. She dies. Starboy becomes an orphan, and that begins yet another story of, in this case, Starboy takes on a new name called Scarface, because of a crescent moon shaped scar on his cheek. So I'll tell the second part of that story a little bit later on in our conversation. But that gives you a sense of how Native stories also really parallel many of the stories that Shakespeare, particularly this one, Midsummer Night's Eve, tells with regard to Puck, with regard to Oberon, and with regard to some of the kinds of events, I guess you might say, in human life that have participation of star beings and earth beings.
Oh, thank you, Greg. When you told it, you left it right with the crescent moon, which is right where the story begins for Shakespeare, because in a passage which Britten and Piers cut, did not use in the opera. They transposed a line of Hippolyta's and put it later in the piece. But of course, when you're making a libretto out of a play, you have to cut because words sung take longer to utter than words spoken. But that beginning of the play is when Theseus, the Duke of Athens, Theseus, and Queen Hippolyta of the Amazons are counting the days until their wedding, and they're counting just past the new moon until that sliver crescent of moon starts to come back into the sky, which will later be called the horned moon, because it looks, when you tip it up, it looks like two horns. But as for what happens on the night of the new moon, when everything is dark, the new moon is the first thing that visitors to the theater at Santa Fe are going to see, because Nisha Jones's production, which is very, very beautifully tipped towards Shakespeare's astronomy. And if you've seen Benedetto Cristofani's sketch, which most people will see on the website for the set, the first thing you notice is a black circle. And we believe that that is representing the new moon, which of course is dark. It represents several other things as well, but we'll let Nisha tell you about those in another segment. I wonder if you would tell us, because I think we didn't mention this yet, but we wanted to, in terms of ritual around the solstice and measurement of the light, we had wanted to discuss a little bit the Chaco Canyon mysteries.
Right. Well, I think I'll begin by saying that all tribes actually have major ceremonies that are calibrated around the summer solstice and the winter solstice. So both are recognized, and also positions of the moon, in its various phases. So again, depending on tribe and place, you're going to find major ceremonies associated, among Native peoples, with the movements of the sun and moon. But particularly with regard to Chaco Canyon, on Chaco Canyon, there in Chaco Canyon, on top of a very prominent feature in Chaco Canyon is a very large natural structure called Fajada Butte. Mm-hmm. And about the third
for those who are watching outside New Mexico, Chaco Canyon is a complex of natural and buildings in New Mexico.
Right. Ancient Anasazi ruins, that are part of the landscape. And so there on top of the mesa, the Fajada Butte Mesa, is a structure where 3 slabs of stone are placed in such a position that when the sun is at its highest point during the solstice, during that very important time of solstice, the sun shows through these 3 particularly placed slabs of limestone. And behind the limestone, just a small concave area behind the limestone, is a spiral that is etched into the wall or into the back of that area. And so when the sun moves to its highest point at noon, the shadow cast by the sun through the lens, if you will, of those 3 stones, casts a shadow that marks exactly the summer solstice, the time of summer solstice, its highest point at noon during the longest day. And so this is a picture of that, just to give you a sense of how that spiral looks and how it actually looks when the sun is cutting through those 3 slabs of stone and using light and shadow to mark that very essential point of time. As it turns out, the structure also also times the 18 and a half year cycle of the moon. So this instrument, without any moving parts whatsoever, using just shadow and light and the movement of sun and moon, marks the exact time of those very important phases of sun and moon.
For those of you who watched The Marriage of Figaro and you've been working with Laurent Pelly's clock on stage with all the moving parts visible, here is a much
Right.
older and much simpler clock. Mm-hmm.
Right. So certainly there were probably many stories associated with that. Certainly there are ceremonies and rituals associated with that time of year. Mm-hmm. But again, I think all over the world, cultures would have celebrated in some way, particularly the summer solstice, yeah, and also the winter solstice, as well as the equinoxes, because they were so important. They were so important to timing, hunting, timing, planting. They were important times to mark in the life of people and also the life of these entities that were so important to native peoples.
Greg, didn't you say that the moon showed with shadow? The moon, like the sun gave the sun dagger.
Yes, the moon also shadows. The moonlight also creates a shadow. It's more subtle than the sun, of course, but the sun dagger and the sun spiral behind it were able to capture both sun and moon light in such a way that it was able to mark both the movement of the sun and the movement of the moon, which is more complex. It goes through an 18 and a half year cycle from minimum to maximum and then back to minimum. And so it's actually a more complicated cycle than simply the sun. But to have it integrated in just one instrument, if you will, in this case, the sun dagger is both ingenious and there's actually no other place in the world where this has been done. Although there are many sites that do mark the sun and moon. Many sites in Athens and Greece, through in Asia. Actually throughout the world, throughout the British Isles, you have many sites that are calibrated, to sun and moon observations.
I was just going to add, I think a place like Chaco Canyon is an amazing example of a kind of a bridge from these wonderful stories to real science, complex science. I mean, that these are instruments of very very detailed accuracy, able to not just sort of have a certain look when a certain things happen, but they're making predictions, right? And that's all science is, right? So I think that there's a much stronger coupling as opposed to difference than what's going on. That the stories and what we call now modern science are very closely linked. It wasn't there was an abrupt change. Okay, we're going to stop telling these stories and we're going to do measurements and make papers. But the stories were the papers of the time, and they were conveying very important information. And that ability to make predictions, that's all we call science now. Yeah.
To make predictions. What do you do? I was wondering if you would tell us a little, since we mentioned light and shadow, I wondered if you would lead us into the shadows a little bit and tell us about things that are less predictable.
The universe itself, there's a huge amount of space out there. And I think we don't always perceive that in our mind, especially when we're talking about the moon and the sun, right? For example, the moon, we see it right there. You know that you can take all of the planets in our solar system, including the huge ones, Jupiter. Jupiter is enormous compared to Earth. You can take them all and put them between the Earth and the moon. They would all fit in there. I wouldn't do it. Make some pretty big waves, but it's vast. The space is vast. The distances between objects are more than we can usually perceive as human beings. And that turns out it's the same when we get inside of us. We're mostly nothing. We're mostly nothing. Don't despair. The stuff that works is great, but we're mostly nothing. So we find this out. But what we did was we have brilliant people taking these beams, squeezing them really tight with magnetic, superconducting magnets, and they make it so we have interactions. We get a certain number of interactions every second. We actually get 1 billion of these protons to interact every second. And sometimes they do something interesting, and we see stuff that comes out. So what key goes on here is I like to think of this like this play that Shakespeare was somehow brilliantly foreseeing quantum field theory, the theory that we use to do particle physics, because he starts in this state in Athens where you sort of know what's going on. You know, people have certain loves or non-loves. Right. Or you want to add something to?
No, classical state, right? This is the
classical state, something you can measure. You know, either you know, the woman's in love with this guy or this guy, but it was something all you can measure. And then we go into the woods, and then eventually come back out to Athens. So we do this, and it turns out there's a guy named Heisenberg who was very uncertain. He gave us the uncertainty principle, which it fundamentally at the point of what we're doing, it tells us there's a certain area where we really can't measure. At a certain size, you get small enough, you cannot have a precise enough detector to ever see what goes on in there. And so the same thing is happening for us, and we sort of measure this effect. This thing that we don't see, something happens. We bring the particles together, stuff happens. That's a technical term. Stuff happens. And then other particles come out. What's interesting is we see several things that affect here. We see Einstein happening because we're taking these particles. It's essentially, I call them protons. They're really up quarks and down quarks that are moving around there, and some gluons holding them together. And we're giving them a lot of energy, and then that energy can become mass. So E becomes mc squared, and you can produce other particles that you haven't seen before, you've never measured before. But then instantly, those particles return to become other particles, and we have to reconstruct what happened in the center. And we never know. The trick is we never know exactly what happened each collision by collision, and we will never know. That's part of the theory, is that you'll never know that. But we can statistically, by the stuff that comes out, reconstruct a theory. We can reconstruct what goes on inside it. And what goes on in the woods, as you know, it's craziness, right? You know, getting the ass's head and and people falling in love with different people,
and the potion and the juice and the fairies and all of it.
There's a really, really good chance, don't tell my colleagues, there's a really, really good chance that human beings will never really completely understand our universe. And this scale, you know, we live in a certain scale, very limited scale. You know, we're a couple meters tall, and we move at a certain speed, and that's why it's such a challenge, right? All the easier stuff, the gravity stuff and things like this, we did early. But now there's the things that are really far, that are really fast, that are really big or really small, the extremes that we have to build devices to try to understand it. I think I might have mentioned this before, but science now is trying to understand things that we don't really see. It takes me back to a student, a young student, I think in middle school, who during we have virtual visits where I'm down in our detector and I'm talking to a classroom, and the classrooms are there, and sometimes they're awake, sometimes they're not. Usually the middle school, they're awake. It's when you get up to 11th and 12th grade, that the high schoolers, you see a lot of yawning in the audience. They're still paying attention, but it's a challenge. But this guy, he was a young guy, and he was looking at it, and he just sort of was thinking it through, and we talked about dark matter, and he says, well, how do you measure what you can't see? And this this profound sentence, which is to this day amazes me. That's science in a nutshell. That explains it. How we're going about trying to measure what we can't see, and we're trying, and the stuff we can't see we call a theory. We have a theory to sort of describe what's going on in there, but we may never really have a theory that will completely predict everything and will completely explain everything. And so we may always need the great stories, like Greg has told us. We'll have to get more of those to satisfy our curiosity.
It seems that those are the people Shakespeare's talking about when you're saying, how do we measure what we can't see, the things we can't see, the people we can't see in the woods are, of course, the fairies. And Greg, I think you have some of those people.
Well, in listening to Steve, I'm reminded of, this notion of the great mystery that Native people refer to, with regard to the unseen. And really the inhabitants of the unseen are the spirits, and particularly the spirits of the little people, as they're called many times. These are the very much the fairies that are referred to, in Shakespeare's play. These are the Pakwachis, as they are called in Mexico, among the Aztecs. And these are the little people, as they're called here in North America. So I'm reminded of a story that it's actually an Iroquois story of a young hunter who's out in the woods hunting, and he kills a rabbit, and then he encounters these little people, that are also in the forest hunting, and feeling compassion for these little hunters that have not taken anything yet. He gives them the rabbit that he has killed, and they're so thankful for his generosity that they invite him to dinner to their village. And so this is a village of little people, and they are just similar to humans, but they also are spirits of nature, and they have their powers, if you will. And so he sits down to dinner, and they share stories with each other. They come to really regard this young man in a high way, and because of his compassion and him sharing his rabbit with them. So they tell him that, they show him, because they're also dancing during this dinner, this feast, and they show him the dance that they have. And it's called the dark dance. It's the dance of darkness. And so they go and they part ways, and they tell the young hunter, take this dance back to your people. And when you dance this, we will sure to be there with you. In the shadows, you will not see us, but we will be there. And they also give gifts back to the young man to take back to his village. One of the major one is the dance itself, but also other kinds of gifts that he takes back to his village. And of course, he takes back the story of the dark dance, and also the story of the little people and his encounter, the spirit people, spirits of the forest, of the land. And so that's one of the stories, because there are actually many stories of little people among different tribes that could be told. But it's really similar to to Puck and to the fairies, that they intercede in a variety of different ways in human life, unseen except when they want to be seen.
Except when they want
and then go back, to their realm, which is the dark, the forest. And but nonetheless, they do guide and instruct, but they also reprimand and punish human beings, for wrongdoings.
Mhm.
And so this is this idea of, the spirit helpers and the spirit beings that inhabit all of life, that Native people have stories about. And in this case, the Iroquois story.
It's funny, in Midsummer, you have, and this is part of Shakespeare's great achievement in weaving together, like Bottom the Weaver, weaving from bottom to top, various ranks of being. So you have different kinds of fairies which normally wouldn't appear in the same story. Puck, the trickster,
Right.
I hope we'll say another word about trickster characters.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
so he's a bit of a town fairy, and then there are
Right.
wood, and then he happens to be an Oberon's service, sometimes grudging service. It's sometimes hard to tell whether he's a rebel or whether he really is trying to follow order. But then you have all these other little fairies who serve Titania. So he's his fairy, and these are hers fairies, and they are the woodland fairies who are named after plants, and herbs. There's mustard seed, who's a seasoning, peas blossom, who's a flower, and you can make tea out of peas blossom. Um, Cobweb, who's used as a bandage. I mean, still some people in different parts of Appalachia use cobwebs as bandages, and moth, who may represent the actual little insect, but may be Shakespeare's spelling of mote. You could spell it M-O-T-E or M-O-T-H. And a mote, of course, is the tiniest particle or speck of matter that there is. And so I of course,
Right.
love that for its quantum implications because they're so small and they're so busy. They're working all the time.
Right.
She gives them all these assignments. She even says to them at one point, for the third part of a minute, meaning 20 seconds, you need to go and strip the bark off this branch or make a nest out of this. Or she gives them very specific tasks, kind of botanical tasks to do, but she really keeps them busy. I don't know that they get to decide whom they will reward and whom they will punish because they are busy worrying about whether they will be rewarded or punished by the queen. But they have a very good time when Bottom comes to visit, and they give him wonderful fruits, and they sing him to
Right.
sleep. Yeah, it's very beautiful.
Well, I think it's similar, this notion of the trickster and Puck playing the role of the trickster in Shakespeare's play. I think that trickster element, which, and Stephen can talk about this, is chaos, really, the notion, the idea of chaos and chaotic activity, but also is the source of creativity in parallel to that, or in integration with that. The trickster, of course, is the trickster. So, but in other kinds of situations, he also is the bringer, in this case, of fire, the bringer of wisdom and thought, to the people as well. So he plays both the role of being the oaf and the, that kind of typical trickster, but also is a sacred character, very similar to Puck.
Yes, and the Greeks and Romans made him a god because even in Midsummer, you have Puck, who is the trickster character for this cast, but there's always the awareness of Cupid because the flower juice, the potion for restoring the lovers to their proper partners, Oberon wouldn't have known about it. It wouldn't have been possible had Cupid himself not shot an arrow past, apparently, Queen Elizabeth, an imperial voter. It missed her. This was Shakespeare's wonderful way of integrating her into the whole plot. But it landed on a nearby flower, which became what was called love in idleness, which might be sort of a pansy. But it just puts, it keeps in the audience's mind that the bigger trickster is the god, is Cupid, who brings love, but also chaos. So
I think that fits in really well because out of all the things we do, like I say, nothing's predetermined. We can't do a collision and know what's going to come out. And we can only measure it, and essentially we don't give up. I say we have a model, but the model is only going to tell you statistically what happens. So in a sense, we're saying there's a trickster. There's a trickster involved, and he or she is doing whatever. But the only thing that's slightly different is that the trickster, in our case, has to follow some rules. So a particle could, a Higgs boson, this was the thing that our experiment became famous for in 2012. We found this particle, which again had been predicted in 1964. It amazes me what human beings have done in that time to predict the existence of this. This is the particle which is associated with a field that gives fundamental elementary particles mass. Okay, so it's something which is really at the core of our theory. It's something that's strange for us to understand. Why would something which has no volume, which is an elementary particle, have mass? That just really puzzled us for quite some time. It's still puzzling if you try to think about it in our sort of macroscopic minds. But it's how that each particle, how it interacts with this field that tells you what its mass will be. The bigger its mass, the more it interacts with the field. So we've learned that we're measuring. We're in the process of measuring this. So far, every measurement we've made shows us that, darn it, these guys were right. In 1964, they figured it out, and it's frustrating. We would like for something to disagree, but this if we produce one of these, which we can, it happens every maybe trillion. One out of a trillion collisions, you're going to make a Higgs boson, and that Higgs boson then can transform to other particles. And there's different probabilities. It's a higher probability that it will transform to a couple heavy B quarks. Those are the more massive things. But it can also, with a less of a probability, transform into lighter particles, like muons or even electrons or things like this. It's just a smaller probability. And so, Puck could easily have put the lotions or the potion, whatever you want to call it, on the right person or a wrong person, depending on where Puck was going at the time, and we couldn't predict it. Puck is not just this trickster is not predictable, and
right.
and put
the fairies
put
are for sure bosons because they're shapeshifters.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, they're bosons. They're going from.
And bosons are friendly. They can occupy the same space at the same time, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good connection there because we have these sort of two kind of types of particles. There's those which make up matter, electrons, quarks, things like this, muons. You may have heard of. They're sort of matter particles, and then there's the things that carry the forces, and these are the bosons. And so they're the fairies. The fairies are carrying the forces from one matter particle to another, and you cannot predict. It's just like the Higgs boson. If you produce another kind of boson, you don't know what it's going to transform into. So you produce it, and then it transforms. The probability it'll transform into certain ones, but maybe it went to others. So maybe some got the love potion and others didn't, and that was maybe depending on the mood of Shakespeare when he was writing the play, it could have been somebody else that the potion got put on.
Exactly. I thank you, Professor Greg Cajete and Professor Steve Goldfarb. Thank you for blowing our minds.
Well, thank you so much, Lucy. It really is a pleasure to relearn Shakespeare. I'm going to go back and read some more books now.
I'm glad you found your daughter's copy.
Yes. So thank you. No, it really was a lot. It was a big pleasure. It's always fun to do something with Greg, and this was a really great topic. So
absolutely, it's been a pleasure as well, Lucy and Stephen, and you've perked my interest as well into this trickster called Shakespeare.
This trickster called Shakespeare. Excellent.
Very good. Very well put.
Thank you both. And we will see you at the opera.